If everyone can please take a seat, we're going to start in just a few minutes. My name is George Zambakis, and I'm the current president of the Hellenic Professional Society. We want to thank everyone for coming this evening. The poetry event is one of the highlights of each season, and we really appreciate all of the research and the practice that goes into this each year. So we want to thank Alex, Katerina, and Dimitri. Let's give them a hand. Tonight we're very honored to have in our audience the Greek Council, Alexandros Theodoropoulos. And just a few matters of business before we get started. If everyone could take a moment to turn off their cell phones, please. And our treasurer asked me to remind everyone to please pay your dues before the end of the year. If you have any questions of whether or not you're up to date, we do have a list so we can check that off for you. And
no, if you have any questions, you're not up to date.
So we do have a list if you want to check if you're not sure. Our next event is going to be the Christmas party on December the 19th at 6:30 at the Kontogeorgaki residence. Those invitations will be going out shortly, so look for those in the mail in about 2 weeks. And after the reception, after the presentation, if you will please join us for a reception. We have things set up in the back, and we also have newsletters. And without further ado, I would like to turn the podium over to Alex. Thank you.
So, welcome everyone. Usually, our annual poetry events center around one of the towering figures that ended up dominating the Hellenic world during the last 2 centuries. Palamas, Kavafi, Varnalis, Seferis, Elitis, even our beloved forlorn sailor Kavadias. A few others, Sikelianos and Ritsos come to mind, have left such indelible marks on the Greek psyche so as to merit their own special evenings. The inevitable question, however, comes to mind. What next? What became of modern Greek poetry after all these one-of-a-kind poets left us their work 50 or 100 years ago? Who has taken the baton of modern Greek poetry, and what are they doing with it? That's what we're discovering tonight. The obvious immediate answer to the question who is no one. But this answer does not imply a vacuum. On the contrary, the Greek literary landscape has brimmed with noteworthy poets in the last few decades. And these poets express an enormous diversity of experiences, subjects, and techniques. This is no longer Greece of a century ago, where jostling young poets were all trying to emulate Palamas. In our quest tonight, we are faced with an array of truly remarkable and often unclassifiable interpreters of contemporary Hellenism. It couldn't have been any other way due to 4 major forces that impacted poetic souls, each force different from the others: historical trauma, social shifts, global culture, and poetry's evolution. Those 4 forces are actually decisive because they pulled individual poets along different paths in the rich garden they planted. We will take the first half of tonight's presentation to explain those 4 forces. Starting with the first of the 4, trauma is an apt word to describe the historical reality that many of these poets grew up with. Those born in the 1910s through 1940s were shaped by their first-hand experiences of the famine and fighting associated with the Axis occupation of Greece between 1941 and 44, and by the despicable violence and blood resulting from the Greek Civil War that immediately followed, which was the first major act of the Cold War. The Civil War ended in 1949 with a British and American-backed victory against the communist insurgents in Greece. However, the country remained bitterly divided for decades, as galleons of left-wing sympathizers were exiled and refused professional opportunities, and as the psychological and personal wounds of the horrors of war took their decades to heal. Young poets of the time could not remain indifferent to the devastation and disappointments around them. So, as Greece took to rebuilding in the 50s, the bulk of original poetic work was extremely dark and pessimistic. This was not bad poetry. It was the result of the realization that reconstruction and economic growth could not make a country whole without the human, honest, and realistic confrontation with the recent past. Takis Sinopoulos was a leading figure among the so-called first post-war generation of Greek poets who took on that task. Born near Pyrgos, Ilia, in 1917, and a doctor by profession, he came of age at the beginning of this most terrible decade of Greece's recent history, running from the Metaxas dictatorship through war, occupation, and the horrors of civil war, many of which he experienced firsthand as a doctor. He called the civil war a black infection which covered them up, Greece gasping for breath. These experiences and their exorcism inform much of his work, as did the colonel's dictatorship, the junta of 1967 to 74. Here's the poem Philippos, which appeared as part of a longer poem, Exodus, in a 1957 collection.
Φίλιππος. Εδώ στοχάζομαι, δεν θα ξανάρθει ο Φίλιππος σε τούτη την ακίνητη κοιλάδα. Πολλά του τάξαμε, από λάφυρα και σιρήνες. Μα εκείνος ήταν στραμμένος σ' άλλα οράματα. Μια απέραντη πατρίδα ονειρευότανε. Πού είναι το πρόσωπό σας, το αληθινό σας πρόσωπο, μου φώναξε. Έφυγε κλαίγοντας. Ανέβηκε τα λαμπερά βουνά. Δεν θα ξανάρθει ο Φίλιππος. Αμετανόητος, πάντα πείσμονε. Οι σκοτεινές μέρες του φταιγάν, τα ερειπωμένα πρόσωπα. Το αίμα του ακούγοντας ανέβηκε τα λαμπερά βουνά. Και απόμεινα μονάχος, περπατώντας και σφυρίζοντας μέσα στην κούφια Λάρισα.
Since we are talking about Sinopoulos, it would be amiss to not bring up his most famous poem, the stunning Okeomenos, the burning one, which is a most vivid description of voluntary death by self-combustion. Self-combustion was a rare, but not unheard of, act of desperation from those dark days of the Greek Civil War.
Οκεόμενος. «Κοιτάχτε, μπήκε στη φωτιά», είπε ένας από το πλήθος. Γυρίσαμε τα μάτια γρήγορα. Ήταν στα αλήθεια αυτός που απόστρεψε το πρόσωπο όταν του μιλήσαμε. Και τώρα καίγεται, μα δεν φωνάζει βοήθεια. Διστάζω. Λέω να πάω εκεί, να τον αγγίξω με το χέρι μου. Είμαι από τη φύση μου φτιαγμένος να παραξενεύομαι. Ποιος είναι τούτος που αναλύσκεται περήφανος? Το σώμα του το ανθρώπινο δεν τον πονά? Η χώρα εδώ είναι σκοτεινή και δύσκολη. Φοβάμαι. Ξένη φωτιά μην την ανακατεύεις, μου είπαν. Όμως εκείνος καίγονταν μονάχος, καταμόναχος. Και όσο αφανίζονταν, τόσο άστραφτε το πρόσωπο. Γινόταν ήλιος. Στην εποχή μας, όπως και σε περασμένες εποχές, άλλοι είναι μέσα στη φωτιά και άλλοι χειροκροτούνε. Ο ποιητής μοιράζεται στα δυο.
Alongside his poetry, Sinopoulos, who died in 1981, was an astute and prolific critic as well as a talented painter, and his encouragement helped launch the very much younger poets who became known as the generation of the 70s. Moving on from the traumas of history, social shifts are the second of the four forces that shaped post-war poetry. A largely agricultural society that depended mostly on non-mechanized human and animal labor in the early 50s, Greece had already become a typical